For this media arts assignment, I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite shows of all time, Tomohiko Ito's 2016 miniseries, Erased. Erased is about 29-year-old Satoru Fujinuma, a struggling manga artist who at random moments during his day will suddenly be shot back in time anywhere from 1 to 5 minutes. And it always happens right before something bad is about to go down. So whenever he realizes that he's been shot back, he looks for whatever this potential terrible event might be and he tries to stop it. He has no idea why this happens to him, but the why of the situation isn't the purpose of the story. It's all about what he does with it. After a particularly traumatic event in his present, he's suddenly shot back a whole 18 years into the body of his 12-year-old self. He decides that in order to stop this traumatic event in his present, he needs to prevent a string of serial kidnappings and murders that took place back when he was a child in 1988, the time he is in now. This serial killer targets kids, some of which Satoru knew before they died, so he spends the show trying to protect his previously murdered friends, as well as trying to connect with the other kids who he knows will die if the events of this time aren't altered. All while still trying to discover who the killer might be. This show's greatest strength is definitely its incredible pacing and tight storytelling. Erased is never for a single moment boring, and damn near every single scene feels necessary and important to the story or characters. There's just no fat on this show whatsoever. Everything that's here fully feels like it needs to be here. The vast majority of these 12 episodes end on cliffhangers, a method which does wonders for keeping the show constantly engaging. As for the technical aspects, this show has some pretty good animation and some pretty good music. These two elements never feel off, but they also never feel impressive. It's not mind-blowingly animated like Violet Evergarden, and the music isn't stunningly composed like in Violet Evergarden, but the show is still good on these fronts. There are a handful of really strikingly composed shots despite the very normal-looking animation, and while the intro feels kind of tonally inappropriate for a show involving child murder, the outro is, Erased is also what I like to call the perfect starter anime. There are a number of things about it that make it very accessible to those not familiar with the medium, or even those with somewhat of an aversion to it. It's on Netflix, the English dub is actually great, it has a compelling and easy to follow story, there's nothing pervy in it, the characters are excellent, it's both funny and emotional, and it's only 12 episodes long. Just under 4.5 hours in total. That is an extremely small commitment compared to most other shows out there. It's not like One Piece or something. Everything about the show makes it the perfect starter anime. I showed it to both my parents, who know next to nothing about anime, and they both liked it quite a bit. This show is a masterclass in tonal balance because it manages to pull off being pretty lighthearted in one moment and then extremely dark in the next without these two tones ever clashing even a little. Erased has a cast full of very charming characters, lots of wholesome friendship moments between the kids, and quite a bit of good comedy throughout, with an especially funny running joke between Satoru and his mom Sachiko. But on the other side of the coin, you still have the constantly discussed subject of literal child murder, several scenes where emotions are running very high, and an incredibly disturbing subplot involving one of the kids who has a physically abusive mother. They treat these dark themes with a lot of respect, though. It never feels exploitative or like they're just mining for empty shock value. This show's dark side is genuinely harrowing, and it only serves to make the show even more compelling. It very much is not edgy. And the show's funny moments are always placed comfortably separately from the dark stuff, so nothing ever feels tonally inappropriate. As for the show's overall theme, it mostly boils down to the importance of believing in people. Believing in others, believing in yourself, and believing that others believe in you. The biggest reason why Satoru is a struggling manga artist in the beginning is basically because he doesn't believe in himself. He's rather apathetic about his life, and he doesn't trust anyone enough to the point where he would actually open up to them about his deep-seated trauma, the trauma that is actively preventing him from believing in himself and being the best person that he can be. Satoru has many personal failings throughout the show, failings that are only rectified as soon as he decides to start believing in himself and others. From this point on in the video, there are going to be massive spoilers for the whole rest of the show. I know that my teacher's never going to watch this show, and then he has to watch the rest of the video regardless in order to mark me, but for the other 3 people who are watching this video, stop it right here and go watch Erased. I don't even expect you to come back afterwards. Just go watch Erased. It is the best anime that I have personally seen, and I consider it to be borderline flawless.
With that said, let's talk about my very short list of issues with the show.
Full spoilers from this point onward. There are a few moments throughout the show that I can only describe as being just kind of awkwardly executed. The first episode literally has one of those inverted black and white, he was normal until he wasn't type transitions, and it just feels very over the top. Satoru's dramatic internal monologues can occasionally be somewhat unintentionally funny. And that whole plot point where Satoru tells Kenya that he wants to be a superhero in order to hide from him the fact that he's from the future led to some strange dialogue here and there.
You're the Bucket Brigade.
Superheroes always get the shaft, don't they?
Damn straight.
Well, that was weird.
And while I previously said that this show is airtight in terms of there being absolutely no unnecessary scenes, there is that one clincher at the end of that one episode where Yashiro speaks with Kenya.
And after having watched this show like 7 times, I still have no idea what the purpose of that scene was.
Nothing about the dynamic between Yashiro and Kenya ever comes up again, and Kenya's actions don't feel significantly different after this point.
Like, what even was this?
But to talk about the only actually significant problem with the show, we need to talk about specific characters, starting with Yashiro. The show's biggest problem is definitely the fact that the killer is so easy to predict, and it's not that Yashiro gives off obviously bad vibes or something. The show only very occasionally makes him look at all suspicious before his reveal. The problem is just that there weren't nearly enough potential suspects from an audience perspective. We're only given 3 other suspects that are even remotely possible, and only one of them is ever made to look even slightly suspicious to us. Suspicion that is very quickly waved away. Yashiro is given so much screen time and development before his reveal that it becomes obvious he's the only narratively satisfying choice for the killer. This show definitely could have benefited from having a greater amount of significant adult characters for us to be suspicious of. But despite the fact that Yashiro being the killer is so easy to predict, he's still an excellent character. Every time I rewatch this show, I get so incredibly bummed out that he's the killer, because before his reveal, he's insanely likable and fun. He's kind but assertive with his students, he has an excellent dynamic with Satoru, and he seems to genuinely care about Kaio's safety.
And they must have known that he would be easy to predict, because they try to throw you off his trail hard.
Satoru trusts him fully, he was legitimately a big help in saving Kaio, and that whole misdirect with his candy addiction was super funny and very much tried to make it seem like all secrets about him had been revealed.
Every time I see this show, knowing the true nature of this seemingly wonderful and genuinely likable man, I just... I love watching him on screen every single time, even though I know he's secretly evil. And he maintains a lot of his likability even after revealing his insane murderous ideology.
I already touched on Satoru's character arc in an earlier section, so I won't talk too much more about him here, but I do need to mention how excellent the final confrontation between him and Yashiro was. Their dialogue all throughout that scene was so incredibly riveting. Satoru overall is a very likable and realistic protagonist. He has just enough personality and is very easy to root for and be engaged in. Kaio is also an engaging character, but for very different reasons. She's quite intriguing and eventually super endearing, but also extremely tragic given her horrific home life and history. All the moments in this show that make me cry revolve around her. Those brief glimpses of her being actively abused by her mother disturbed me to the point of tears. And that scene in the morning after she spends the night at Satoru's gets me every single time.
I'm starving. Wait, no curry?
That's your dinner for the next month.
What? There can't be that much left.
You'll just have to invite everyone over again.
Seeing this kid who for years has lived in an impoverished and oppressive home environment wake up to a warm breakfast and people who genuinely care about her, and seeing that whole experience absolutely break her is one of the most powerful things I've ever seen in animation.
Kaio is very emotionally compelling, subtly charming in her own way, and she has an excellent dynamic with Satoru. She'd be my favorite character in the show if it weren't for one other.
Sachiko is the best mom in the history of animation, and no one can tell me otherwise.
She's incredibly loving, very funny, super smart, endearingly dedicated, and also very subversive to what you would typically expect of parent characters in these types of stories. In other shows where child characters are doing something sort of risky, like trying to save a friend from an abusive parent by hiding them away in an abandoned bus, the parents of the protagonist would probably just lose their minds and scold the kids about how dangerous they're being. Parents are always obstacles in these stories, but that is not the case with Sachiko. She actually helps Satoru save Kaio from her mother and is constantly there for her son, being just as much a friend as she is a mom. And the lengths that she went to keep Satoru healthy in his 15-year coma, that was just so incredibly tragic, but also really heartwarming. She's easily my favorite character in the show. But I also need to mention this show's other mother, Akimi Hinazuki. For most of the anime, she's just an abusive, horrible, pretty evil person who you desperately want to see Kaio escape from. But then we meet her mother, and through them learn some of Akimi's background. She was abused by her husband, evidently more violently than she's ever treated Kaio. She wasn't always this horrible, evil, broken person. Hurt people, and she's made some horrible decisions in response to her trauma.
Now let me make something very clear here. Akimi's own tragic history does not justify anything she's done.
Nothing about her backstory makes the abuse she's dealt against Kaio even remotely okay. But the fact that this show was able to make me feel even the slightest amount of empathy for this...
Well, Satoru says it best.
bitch is truly astounding. Some sort of story about her learning to become a better person would be really interesting to watch. I believe that her grief in episode 9 could lead to genuine change down the line.
There's no one else here really worth talking about in depth, but there are a few others that I would like to mention quickly.
Yuki was odd but endearing, Hiromi was very likable, also how the hell were they a boy? Aya was very entertaining for the brief amount of time she was present, and Kenya was a really solid main friend for Satoru. And I also really like Airi. I think it's an interesting detail how she only existed in the show at the very beginning, the very end, and the exact middle. Having her and Satoru's reunion be the final scene in the show was genius. It leaves you with a genuinely great feeling after such an emotionally taxing show. Speaking of the ending, I'd now like to talk about how some of the decisions made in this show's last few episodes are slightly controversial among many. A lot of people say that the ending of Erased ruins the show, and I still don't really get that. First, you have the shipping problem. Throughout the show, Satoru and Kaio build up a really great dynamic. In episode 2, Satoru ends up having to say that he likes Kaio in order to start saving her from her mother. And while the two do share several cute scenes and moments of mutual flusteration, the show has this great running joke of constantly reminding you that Satoru is still, in fact, a 29-year-old man. Even though the 12-year-old half of his brain does develop something of a crush, he's ultimately only getting close to Kaio in order to save her life, so obviously they don't end up together in the end.
But I see people online every other week still complaining about them not ending up together, and I just find that kind of weird.
Maybe you could argue that it wasn't necessary to show that she got married to Hiromi, but showing that she has a family now is a great way of displaying how much Satoru saved her. Kaio wouldn't have any of her current happiness if it weren't for Satoru helping her out of her awful home life. I would argue that her having a family now is an important detail to make the show feel more complete and effective and like something was accomplished.
Some people also complain that the whole 15-year coma thing is a stupid plot point, and while I don't agree with that personally, I can definitely at least understand having that point of view.
And one gripe that I do kind of agree with in regards to these last two episodes is that they do feel sort of rushed in places. I take no issue with anything that actually happens in them, but I feel like these events maybe could have been spread out over the course of 3 episodes instead of 2.
I have nothing more to add for this conclusion. Erased is excellent. It's my second favorite anime of all time. Highly recommend. Go watch it. Goodbye.